Hello and welcome to our special programme for Anzac Day. We're here at the Museum of Transport and Technology in Auckland in the brand new Kiwiana Centre. You may be able to hear the distant sound of sheep shearing over in the corner there. We're here to talk about 3 books that have been released specially for this day and meet their authors. The first one's called Fernleaf, Cairo. It's about what happened to Kiwis who found themselves in North Africa during the war. We also find out what happened to them in Italy. That's in a book called A Fair Sort of Battering. And we'll also be meeting a different sort of hero called Caesar. Later in the programme, we'll be finding out about the Anzac role in the restoration of Israel, as documented by historian Kelvin Crombie. But first, let's meet Megan Hutching. Well, Megan, you're the author of 2 of the books we're talking about today, Fernleaf, Cairo and A Fair Sort of Battering. They're both very personal sort of books. They're not dealing with the big stories, just dealing with individuals. Was that a conscious decision on your part?
Yes it was, because I like to read about history from a personal point of view, and people telling stories about their own lives and how that affected them. It's often what gets left out of military histories, so I was really keen to get those personal stories and for the people's voices themselves to come through and so that they could actually talk about how the war affected them.
One of the things that comes across is, I suppose, the sheer monotony of war. A lot of it's actually quite dull and boring.
I think so, yeah. I mean, that was quite a surprise to me when I first started doing the books as well. It was because I thought there'd be a lot of action, you know, and that everybody who went away to war was fighting in the front line. But of course, it's nothing like that at all. And in fact, a lot of it's waiting for things to happen. So yes, it's quite surprising, really. Which
is what makes Fernleaf, Cairo so interesting, because there are thousands of Kiwis there in what has become a town. Just tell us a bit about Camp Mardi. What was there?
Well, it had pretty much everything, really. It had lots of tents to start with, where the troops were, and then it had huts. But it also had administration buildings, because that's where the Expeditionary Force, the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, was based. And it had picture theatres, not very good ones, but it had a sort of open-air theatre where they would have shows like the Kiwi Concert Party and things like that. It had a pie factory and an ice cream factory. It had more rugby fields than you could think of, and a swimming pool, and it also had huts for the men to go to. So it had the Lowry hut, which was a sort of quite Spanish, Middle Eastern style place, and it had YMCA huts and Church of England huts and various other huts like that. And that was where the men could, and a naffy, and that was where the men would go, and they could play cards, or they could drink beer or tea or coffee if that's what they preferred, although I suspect mostly they didn't. and they had housing and games and things like that. A huge amount of things of stuff was organised for them to keep them busy and to stop them from getting bored, as we talked about before.
Because they could go into Cairo as well, because that was just a train journey away, and that was where Kiwi culture met something completely alien.
It certainly did, yeah. I mean, I think that's when I was doing the interviews for the books, I think that was one of the more interesting things that occurred to me as the more and more I heard about it, was that here were these young men who'd come from New Zealand, half the world away, which was a very British culture at that time, and they ended up in Cairo, which was just absolutely, completely and utterly alien to them. I mean, it was noisy, it was loud, it was dirty, it was a bargaining culture. You just didn't pay over your pounds and get what you were given. It was just completely different. The other thing about Egypt, of course, was that it was such an ancient civilization. So they had, in their heads, they had things like Bible stories, Jesus being born and Joseph and Mary sort of going on the donkey and things like that. So in their head they sort of had those images, as well as the sort of popular culture things like Tutankhamun's tomb had been discovered in the 1920s, and there was The Sheikh, the novel by E.M. Hull, which had been made into a movie with Rudolph Valentino. So there was all this sort of stuff going on as well. So it was sort of slightly familiar, but it was also, the reality of it was just completely overwhelming, I think.
One of the things that feels quite strange is the way they dealt with some of the horrors that they did see, because there are passages where they've come across bodies and they're obviously going through a war zone, and they seem to cope with it in a very matter-of-fact way. It's sort of, oh, well, that's a horrible thing and it's happened, but we'll move on. Is that just how people deal with that sort of trauma?
I think they had to. I mean, I think in a situation like a war, when they were in action, they were constantly moving on. I think they just had to deal with it like that. And I also think it was a coping mechanism. You know, you locked it up in a box and you put it away, and then maybe you dealt with it later, or maybe the fact that you'd done that meant that you didn't have to deal with it later and you were able to keep going. But I mean, there were people who didn't cope with it well, you know, and there were a significant number of people who did suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. But I think that whole sort of matter-of-factness is, it's probably a reflection, in terms of the Fairfield of Battering book, it's probably a reflection of the time that's lapsed since they were actually doing those things. Although they did remember them vividly, so obviously it did make a big impression. So yeah, a combination of the time that's lapsed and also that coping mechanism of just having to get on with it, really.
One of the interesting characters that's in the books is General Freiberg, who, I mean, you think of generals as being very remote and you know, they're running the war, they're not dealing with ordinary people, and yet General Freiberg and his wife were astonishing. I mean, they were just incredible people. They dealt with ordinary people and dealt with them as they were. That's unusual, isn't it?
I think it is, yes. I mean, they did get quite closely involved with what was happening. I mean, Barbara Freiberg was she was responsible for the Tuis, who were the women who worked in the New Zealand Forces Club in Cairo, and then later in Italy, and then later in England. And she sort of took them under her wing, and she was like their sort of mother figure. But she did actually work in the New Zealand Forces Club herself, and used her contacts amongst similar sort of women to herself in Cairo to get them to come and work in the New Zealand Forces Club as well. So there they all were, you know, dishing up cups of tea and cakes and sandwiches, which had been made at Mahdi Camp, and talking to the boys, and, you know, sort of being almost like a shop girl, really, which I think is quite remarkable. And she would also visit the soldiers in hospital, and then write home to their mothers, you know, which, you know, is pretty extraordinary. And the general, or my general as she liked to call him, I think the general was, yeah, I think he was a bit like that too. I mean, I think he certainly had the safety of his troops. I mean, that was paramount for him, I think, to the point where at times he argued with his British superiors and said, no, I don't want to put them in there because, you know, there's going to be too many casualties. But, you know, there's that great sort of apocryphal story, I'm assuming it's apocryphal story about Freiberg, where he's driving around with Montgomery, or sometimes it's some other British general, and the British general says to him, you know, oh, these New Zealand troops they don't salute you, do they? They're very bad like that. And the general said, well, I find that if you wave at them, they generally wave back, you know, and which is a great story, and, you know, let's hope it's true. But even if it's not true, it's a reflection of how the troops that were under his command thought of him. So they felt that would be the sort of thing that he would say. One
of the other interesting things that I think I wasn't prepared for was romance. But I mean, there are war romances between, in one case, between a Kiwi soldier and an Italian woman. And it's a real romance, you know, it goes on and they get married and they live happily ever after. I was unprepared for that, and yet that seems to be something that keeps coming back. Is it because they were thrown together in war? Well,
yeah, it's hard to say, isn't it? I think partly that probably had something to do with it. I mean, there were also marriages between Tuis, for example, and nurses and New Zealand servicemen, as well as the one between Gordon and Luciana Johnston, which is kind of unusual in a way. Although there were, you know, significant numbers of war brides that came back to New Zealand. Yeah, I wanted to include those stories because I thought, you know, that, like you, I thought there would be people who didn't really realise that those sorts of things did happen.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the theme of the book, really, isn't it? It is that in all the awfulness of war, their sheer humanity carries on.
Mm. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think Roberto Rebel said, he kind of puts it really nicely in the introduction. He said something like, war is something that affects everybody, but it's experienced by individuals, and that's what I kind of tried to do in the books. Yeah.
Well, Megan, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
And Megan's books are published by HarperCollins. Now, one of the unsung heroes of World War I was Caesar. Now, not much is known about him, but one person who does know about him is Patricia Stroud. I'll go and find her now.